Good afternoon, everyone here in the room in Toronto, and also everyone joining us online on Zoom. I think we had like over 250 registrations, so that's fantastic. Hopefully some of those people are able to join us. And a special welcome to all of the University of Toronto students visiting from Dr. Mace's Toronto's Architecture and Heritage course. On behalf of ERA Architects, we're thrilled you could all join us in this interdisciplinary panel on architectural facadism. I'm Alessandro Tersigni. I'm a cultural critic at ERA, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that Toronto occupies. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of many First Nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous people from across the continent and the world. This place has changed again and again over time spans both short and long. But what's remained is people interacting, defining their worlds, creating meaning. For those who don't know, ERA is an architecture and cultural planning firm that works to connect people and places, to bridge pasts and presents, and to tell stories about different kinds of value through heritage conservation, landscape architecture, and urban design. This is the second public edition of our weekly Wednesday forum that we've done. Last year, we did one on the topic of heritage and cultural health, and you can watch that on our YouTube channel. Today, we're going to discuss the practice of architectural facadism, or facade retention. What it is, how it's viewed, what it means, and some of the interesting reasons why. As most of you will know, facadism is the practice of preserving the facade of an existing, often heritage building, demolishing the rest, and constructing new architecture behind, within, and around it to create a novel built form. In a uniquely evolving and rapidly expanding city like Toronto, where existing heritage buildings were often constructed at a scale of a city many orders of magnitude smaller than this present metropolis, facadism is prevalent. It allows us to conserve the character of our streets while modernizing and expanding the capacity of buildings for new uses and more people. At the same time, facadism is often viewed as inauthentic, turning heritage buildings into hollow appearances of cultural value while destroying their literal and figurative cores. Today, we're going to explore not how to undertake facadism projects, which is an incredible feat in itself, but rather some of the many ways that facadism can and should be understood by both architects and the public. And to do this, it's my pleasure to introduce our fantastic panel. Please join me in welcoming them. Jessica Mace is an assistant professor of Canadian art and architecture at the University of Toronto. A historian specializing in discourses about 19th and 20th century architecture in Canada, she has published widely on concepts of heritage and their relationships to social and cultural values over time. Jess is the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada and co-leads U of T's Canada Constructed program, which offers new courses in Canadian architectural history and connects students with a wide range of art and cultural sectors. Stefan Novakovic is a writer and senior editor at Azure Magazine. A former editor at Urban Toronto and Canadian architect, Stefan has written extensively on the cultures of architecture, urbanism, and design from a broad range of perspectives for publications including Canadian Interiors, Design Lines, Building Magazine, the New York Review of Architecture, Torontoist, and 3 Magazine. He is a multiple recipient of the Canadian National Magazine Award and frequently speaks at design conferences across Canada. Michael McClelland is an architect, author, and founding principal at ERA Architects. Michael's work spans over 30 years and blends heritage conservation, cultural planning, and urban design to shape buildings, landscapes, and sites of growth across Toronto and beyond. He has worked on the Distillery District, Evergreen Brickworks, the TD Centre, Mirvish Village, the Bay Adelaide Centre, the Royal Ontario Museum, Union Station, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. Michael has edited and co-authored several books, including Concrete Toronto, a guidebook to concrete architecture from the 50s to the 70s, and The Ward Uncovered, the archaeology of everyday life. Welcome. So we're recording this discussion so we can share it with the broader community after the fact, and you can find that on ERA's YouTube channel. There'll be time for questions at the end from everyone in the room and also everyone online. For those on Zoom, just put your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. I've got some questions to start off the conversation. I think a great way to start would be, if you would, each of you talk briefly about your perspectives on facadism and some of the insights, questions, and experiences that it brings to mind for you. And we could go clockwise and start with Jess.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Alessandro. And thank you to my students for coming today. I dragged them along, whether they liked it or not. So thank you for that. And thanks to all of you for being here. To be honest, I was ready to come in here guns a-blazing. As an architectural historian, I'm not necessarily strictly offended by facadism in terms of being a rationalist or being a purist or anything like that. But what does offend me is the frequency with which it's seen as the de facto response to heritage in Toronto, right? And the Ontario Heritage Act allows for this. It was not necessarily set up for that purpose, but it's been sort of taken advantage of in a certain number of cases in Toronto, and we can all think of some really egregious examples of this. So again, just thinking about what's protected, and it's often those character-defining features on the exterior. So that's all that's saved. It's the bare minimum. But I decided not to choose violence today. I decided to take a little bit of a step back and think about the concept a little bit more critically. So I'm grateful for the invite and for the chance to sort of slow down and parse this topic. And I started thinking about, most architectural historians, or many, I should say, I won't paint too broad of a brush, but many think about architectural history from the point of view of that initial moment of conception, that initial design, the context that allowed for it. But again, in my work in heritage, I've always been interested in that idea of the lived experience of a place or the various iterations of a building over time. And of course, facadism is part of that, whether we think about it or not. So in this light, it's a really fascinating phenomenon. So I'm really interested to unpick some of those ideas and to discuss the various different viewpoints with my fellow panelists here today. So I'll end there for now.
Well, for me, I come at it foremost from the perspective of a citizen. I am not educated in architecture or history in any type of serious way. My God, art, not at all. So, but I often think about facadism through this sort of vignette of walking on Yonge Street as a pedestrian. And I think, if you especially go down to stretch from Bloor all the way down to the lake, you'll find a great many examples of it. So I remember this stretch of Yonge as a child. It was sort of full of these sort of kind of grimy, unsavory, older buildings with all sorts of eclectic retail, from sex shops to stuff about the occult and strip clubs, that type of thing. And all of that starting to change over the course of the 21st century as we sort of had a long condo boom here in Toronto. And it's a really sort of trippy experience to sort of see these buildings, or at least the facades and frontages of them, brought back to a sort of pristine, prettied up condition that sort of restores some idea of the 19th century. And behind that, though, you seldom really get the same rhythm of retail and this sort of eclectic urban experiences of 5 storefronts, one after the other, on a sort of really tight-knit block. So it's a sort of bizarre change of a city where you go from the experience of buildings that each might have a retail unit in it, and that sort of, that amount of sort of doorways in terms of a Jane Jacobs type of thinking, that there's so many places to go, creates a certain type of ambiance on the street. And then you go to a sort of aesthetic reinvention of that, where those frontages are now much more sort of beautiful in a sense, in that they're so lovingly and meticulously restored, but the experience of it completely changes because you no longer have that sort of eclecticism of retail. So I think about it through the context of that, and always, to me, this sort of strangeness of restoring some idea of the 19th century that in itself entails a type of erasure of that sort of Toronto that many of us might remember from the turn of the millennium, being replaced by some pristine idea of the 19th century that I'm not really sure ever existed.
Thanks for organizing this, Alessandro. It was great. And this is going to be an interesting discussion. I got asked recently, I was at Daniels, and one of the newer profs in part of a panel discussion looked at me and she said, "You don't do facadism, do you?" And I had to sort of say, kind of enthusiastically, "I'm an architect from Toronto. Of course I do facadism." Like, we have to understand the different contexts of things. And a friend of mine quite a number of years ago organized an RAC conference, Detlef Mertens, and it was called Metropolitan Mutations. And he was talking about he wasn't talking about facades, but he was talking about how the downtown core of the city of Toronto is very different from anywhere else in Ontario, in that it's going through massive mutations, massive changes, where you used to have like 60 different property owners on a block. You now have 2 or 3. And so the whole meaning and the whole language of facades and how you approach buildings and where you enter a building and you come up from the subway, has changed dramatically. And it's the retention of the street wall, which I think is the thing that's interesting for urbanists, and that sometimes involves this retention of facades. But it's a very complicated topic, and I think because it's part of architecture, you can do it well or you can do it poorly. So there's lots of horrible examples, but there are a lot of really good examples. So, and then what does it mean? And I think the other significant thing is how does it relate inside and out? Because you're getting a whole new inside. Is that somehow problematic?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a perfect segue to, if you were to reduce all of your comments to some basic building blocks, it really is about the relationship between in and out. So obviously, the outside and the inside of buildings are really distinct places, and I wonder how you think generally interiors and exteriors relate to each other, and maybe what facadism sort of draws your attention to about that relationship.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's one of the main arguments against facadism. There's not a ton of literature out there about it from an architectural history point of view, but this is one of the main things, that there's this disconnect or dissonance between the facade and between the interior, and that it's jarring for people to move from that exterior space of the historic kind of facade into something that's new and shiny and bright. I'm not particularly moved by that argument. I think people are more resilient than that. We don't necessarily expect it. And historically, it's not a new concept, that disconnect between old and new. Often in the flip of what we see happening in Toronto or in our contemporary understanding of facadism, it was commonplace just to slap a new facade on an old building, right? So we had that kind of disconnect in a different way than we're used to now. People were okay with it. There's so many examples. We can think of Italian Renaissance facades being slapped onto a medieval church. Same with Baroque. If we get into the 18th, 19th century, we start getting these really lavish kind of cake icing Gothic exteriors with a classical interior. But that's what people expected. They had a certain level of comfort, and they didn't want to sort of have weird kind of ornamentations inside, sacrificing what they were used to. So historically, we haven't had a problem with this kind of thing, but I think what becomes a problem in a lot of the ways that facadism is sort of loosely applied here, and not the thoughtful design examples, but it's that incongruency, right? The kind of dissonance between the types of facades that are kept and the types of buildings that are built behind them, right? And Michael, I know you've described this as a jack-in-the-box
Yeah.
kind of phenomenon, and that's a common example that we see in Toronto, and that's something that those are the examples that really stand out. We don't necessarily notice as much the ones that are done well. So again, I think it's less a problem with interior versus exterior versus just that sheer disrupt when you're seeing both vantage points at once.
Well, I think it's a really insightful way to put it, that there's that sort of disconnect or a discrepancy that you can just intuitively feel as a person. But I think, it's important in this sense to really sort of situate facadism within the sort of regulatory and legal sort of city building and urban planning framework that sort of creates it. I think it's really easy to think of facadism as a sort of developer-driven or architect-driven practice. That, what developers and architects like is to tear down these beautiful old buildings and then just slap a facade onto a condo tower. Awful, right? But I think what has happened in Toronto's history is, obviously, one of the really exciting things about our city is that we've been the most fast-growing city in North America for much of the last couple of decades. And part of that comes with the sort of openness of the Canadian immigration system and the dynamism of all of that. And that means for a city like Toronto, which sort of historically hasn't really been a big metropolis, right? Doesn't have a huge historic tenement housing stock, sort of, or mid-rise housing stock. What we end up with is really low-rise environments that then get really sharply redeveloped. And what happens is that our planning guidelines sort of push most of the development onto commercial corridors, right? So beautiful Victorian houses from the 19th century, those are all, for the most part, preserved in situ. We get to keep those for the private homeowners that enjoy them. No one gets to really touch that in a significant way. And that sort of pushes the scale of development onto commercial strips where you get these big towers being built because that's where we can put our housing. And then you layer on top of that sort of our local sort of like building practices and requirements. When you build a big building, it sort of necessitates what's called a type G loading space. I know this sounds to the art history folks here like this is a totally arbitrary, just like urban planning arcana. But this is stuff that deeply influences the shape of the city. It means that you have to have a huge amount of the footprint of your building is reserved for cars and trucks turning around. And that means that it becomes very difficult to actually maintain the interior rhythm of your retail units in the facade. So what ends up happening is you might have had 5 or 6 storefronts, and you just keep the facade. And behind that, now you have one sort of long and shallow space that becomes a TD Bank or a Shoppers Drug Mart, right? And so I think that sort of leads to a worse and a more sort of impoverished pedestrian experience that's bad for the dynamism of the city. So I would say, just to look at it from a sort of like regulatory standpoint, and we'll get into I think more of its sort of like cultural and abstract meaning. I think that's the context that really creates this sort of discrepancy between the interior and the exterior.
I just want to go back to Jessica's comment about different time periods. Like, for example, when Gothic first came forward, Gothic was a term everyone hated. It was a pejorative term. So Gothic. Yeah. And I think in fine art, but also in kind of contemporary terms, we need to look at the terms we use. Mm-hmm. They're eventually, look forward in a while. There'll be courses on facadism and postmodernism and all these other things. I think in Toronto, the interesting thing was that I think early part of Peter Dickinson's career, he built an office building for himself on Richmond, and it didn't have one facade, it had at least 3 facades. All 3 faces of the fourth face backed up against a building, but that was a bit of the street wall kind of character. But the other 3 facades were identical. And that significantly changed how we understand buildings in the city of Toronto. And then follow with IMP and Mies van der Rohe. And Mies van der Rohe's TD Center created a huge plaza in the middle of the block. And so all of a sudden the historical precedent, which was the facades ringed the block. The block was the architectural form, not the individual. The block was the architectural form. The block meant that was the threshold. The facade was the threshold by which you left from the public realm and went into the private realm. The interior of the block was completely private. Who knows what went on there, right? But the facade was specifically designed to tell you this was Mr. So-and-so's shop and it did certain things and blah, blah, blah. And so it had great meaning, very different meaning. And once we started, in the modern period, started to explode and erode the block, people started entering blocks through the path system. You know, all of a sudden, the meaning of the facade on the street was to a great degree lost. And I think from a certain perspective, we need to look at the facade as partly a retention of the street wall and the street character. And you actually, that low street wall, it doesn't matter what's behind it, but the low street wall is fundamental to pedestrian life. What we don't have, and as you said, we still don't have the small shops, which is a significant erosion of what we understand to be public life in the city. But we need to be able to talk about these things, and we need to understand how the city has fundamentally changed. At least certain parts of the city have fundamentally changed. And that's because of these new built forms.
Yeah, totally. That's a really fantastic look at the way that the conditions for facadism are prescribed, like what gives rise to them, and then on the flip side, I'm really interested in how they're described, or like how they're apprehended by all types of people. So architects have professional principles for sort of understanding buildings, but the public often understands buildings in a completely different way, and the public is extremely diverse in the way that it understands culture. So I wonder, it's a leading question, but do you think it's important to consider facadism from kind of a range of lenses, and what might be the ones that are important?
Well, you know, I think I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of sort of a symbolic cultural sense. You know, I think that, you know, oftentimes in sort of Toronto development practices, you know, we have a sort of what city planning might describe as a sort of base building and tower sort of typology. So we have, you know, and Michael, you've said it too, that sort of low street wall of sort of 2 or 3 stories, and then you have a really tall tower behind that. And so, especially when that's combined with facadism, when we have the sort of preserved frontages, there's this idea of a really big city, a huge metropolis hiding behind a small town, hiding behind a small 19th century town. And to me, that's a sort of quintessentially Torontonian thing. It actually tells us a lot about ourselves as a culture, that Toronto's never been entirely comfortable thinking of itself as a big city, doesn't have a history being a big city. And so the way that we have grown in the 21st century has been a fundamentally sort of like apologetic paradigm of urbanism. The big glass tower, it's blue, it blends in with the sky. It's here, but it's not here. Don't look at it. You know, the important thing is to have that, like, that sort of 2-3 story street level experience is always sort of maintained. But I think most folks can tell, being on the street, that, you know, that sort of rhythm and the retail oftentimes isn't really there. I don't mean to you know, go too long, but I'll just say like one more thing, you know, and here's where I actually, you know, turn to the admiration of some of what you guys are doing, not the implicit criticisms. But, you know, the other part of Toronto's identity that I think is so salient is its multiculturalism. So oftentimes when you see these sort of restorations of 19th century buildings, of sort of something being really clean and pristine, it sort of, to me, signifies in a way a sort of like veneration or celebration of a 19th century Victorian city that was so much, I think, whiter and less diverse and less interesting than the place where we live now. Comparatively, you don't see that level of respect given to sort of mid-century apartment buildings or sort of brutalism or modernism overall, which to me are typologies that much more sort of represent the type of Toronto that I've always lived in. So I find that can be quite a sort of uncomfortable thing. But in some of, I think the ERA projects along Yonge Street, like the Bay Adelaide Centre, which has been shown in the background, it has a sort of restored building that's sort of extended via what I think was described as the ghost wall, right, further to the south. So you sort of take the old 19th century building, and then you sort of, it's almost like a plaster cast of it, except it's all white.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, it's a restoration project, but one that in a sort of playful postmodern way kind of hints that, look, we're not restoring history. We can never step back in time. We're tweaking it. We're playing around with it. We're sort of putting the past into conversation with the 21st century. And I love so much the more recent one. I don't know the address, but the one where the fire hall, you have the sort of old spire of the fire hall, and then the sort of frontage of the fire hall is recreated in etched glass. It's really, really obviously fake, right? It's an homage to history, but one that also has that sort of winking quality to it of like, look, Toronto had this history, we went through it, but we can never step back in time. We're putting that into conversation with like the site's like deep queer history and the sort of complexities of 21st century city building. So I tend to like that type of stuff that acknowledges, and I think, Jess, you described it so beautifully, that we have a long history of like tacking stuff onto our facades. The city's fundamentally always been a palimpsest, and I think that's much richer than a sort of binary between the old and the new.
Thanks for those comments on those projects, because I think those are exactly the ones that we've had the most fun with. And I think we recognize the complexity of what this facadism stuff is about. We recognize that it's to a degree almost unique to Toronto. Go to New York. New York, the towers land right on the ground and there's no podium, and it's a very different kind of urbanism. Toronto's urbanism has a lot of this complexity of the retention of street walls. We find we're trying to tell a narrative because I think people are sort of saying, why is that thing there? And the more we can tell, we created this ghost facade on the Bay Adelaide Centre, which was a bit of a fine art deal, but it was also just trying to get people to think about what's there. And I think that was, for us, really important to create a narrative and create kind of a sense of understanding that this, there had to be an unreality to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree on all those points that, the best design has that communication with the local and that sense of placemaking. Like, sorry, modernists, I understand the logic, but it only goes so far. And I do enjoy modernist building. But all this to say, if we're combining old and new in this way, it has to be thoughtfully done. But I think to go back to your initial question, Alessandro, about how important is it to include a diversity of perspectives and voices when we're thinking about these things, I think it's absolutely really important. I mean, you don't need to be a professional to understand good design inherently, right? Feel it in your bones. And I know we tend to be in an echo chamber, those of us kind of in the biz, we talk about these things a lot, but it's really important to step outside of that. And just to give some examples, I asked my students, I pulled some really egregious examples of facadism and asked for their blunt initial impressions. I know a few of them have been popping up on the background on the screen, but if anyone at home wants to look them up, about 1 Bedford Road, and I tried not to pick ERA projects. Just, while we're here, I don't want to get lynched. So about 1 Bedford, and I'm quoting on all these, and I won't identify the students because a lot of them are in the room or in the next room. The facade looks like a very tiny building in front of a much larger one. Strange and bad.
I like it. Strange and bad.
Strange and bad was the add-on. It feels disconnected. I mean, if you have a certain style, sometimes it helps if you stick to it. One student said it looks out of place. It doesn't honor the spirit of the old building, and I think that touches on a lot of what you've already said. But then they added, it looks like a prop. I also showed 70 High Park, so it's, again, a large tower with a kind of large overhang in the front, and the heritage building is tucked in behind. Feels disconnected in its design. Right? And again, this is a mix of students. I do have some architecture students, some art history students, but some in poli-sci and a variety of different fields. So it's really interesting. They're picking up on these things that we've all been talking about. About that one, some students said, not so bad. I wouldn't think if it was facadism if I didn't already know. The incorporation blends in well. I like this one. Another student said, I dislike how set back the heritage facade is and how overpowering the modern one is in relation to it. It doesn't honor the original building. Again, that idea of honoring that original building. Okay, and then I said earlier that I decided not to choose violence, but I did with this example. 426 University, so the old Royal Military building, and again, it's circling here, but if you're at home, 426 University. Again, I'm quoting here, and I do apologize. God awful, so ugly. Who approved of this? It looks like the facade is wearing the rest of a building as a hat. Very silly. I know who wrote this, this one. I'm gonna not look at them. Ugliest building in Toronto. It's the worst way to pull off facadism there is. And then a few more go on and kind of echo some of the ideas we've been looking at. The style of historic and new building are not well integrated. There's a very hard contrast between them, especially around the roof and the overhang of the tower. And then finally, the new tower seems to grow out of the facade like a parasite that has overtaken its host. It's aesthetically intriguing and distinctive, but there's something inherently unsettling about it. So again, these are just raw, honest reactions, and I picked some purposefully. I sort of baited the students on this. But again, they're raising some of those good ideas. There's that disconnect. There's that clash between old and new that's not treated with sensitivity. There's that disrupt, like you say, Michael, modernist buildings and the tradition of glass towers that have grown out of that we still use aren't suited to that kind of 19th century facadism, right? Immediately they're at odds. Yeah. And without even talking about it, just showing a picture, students are picking up on this, right? And I think the general public does as well.
I love the comments, yet listening to them oddly makes me more sympathetic to all of these buildings. And I think it's one of the things that, Michael, you mentioned, that it's a condition that's rather unique to Toronto, right? You build a skyscraper in New York and it just sort of lands right on the street. To me, there's a certain sort of confidence of that. You're being yourself all the way up and down. There's a certain coherence to it. Toronto, I think it sort of reflects this deep struggle of how do we be a big city? How do we do it? Sometimes the new overwhelms the old. Sometimes the new, in my mind, is a little bit too apologetic behind the old. And so I think in history, once we sort of start thinking about the present day through the lens of history, it makes us oddly always, I think, more sympathetic to it. So I think we're going to look back on this time period as a really sort of unique Toronto typology that we may even get architectural visitors from around the world. Check out the really bizarre things that Toronto was doing during this time period. And when you look at it, when you historicize it in that way, the beautiful thing about our built environments is I think they tell us the story of who we are culturally. It's to me, such a succinct and fully formed narrative of Toronto struggling with growth and sort of trying to figure out how to be a real city. It's like oftentimes we disparage the Liebeskind's Rom crystal as like an example of like really clumsy architecture and just like, sort of like cheap, tacked on sort
Those
of.
are fighting words.
I like the crystal, Michael. As time goes on, I become more sympathetic to it because when you look at it through the lens of like the early 2000s, what it tells you is like, it's this time period where we were sort of obsessed with like being a global city. Can we be a great city? And you can sort of see how the crystal sort of feeds that and reflects that sort of like little brother desire to like make a big splash and then to do it like kind of clumsily. Anyway.
Yeah, fascinating. I want to get to the question of taste soon, of which those are all profound examples of. But I think everything that you guys said, including those comments from your students, is driving at is the question of authenticity and whatever that could mean. So I think defining, identifying, and cultivating authenticity is like one of the primary goals of heritage conservation. And yeah, what do you think authenticity means in buildings and facades?
Well, I could start that by saying there's been a lot of work internationally about what authenticity means. And it means different things in different places. There's very different senses of what's authentic, what's not authentic. Cultures actually vary on that. And I think actually focusing a little bit on like, hey, what does Toronto do? Toronto does really weird things with its buildings. But that's Toronto's character. Mm-hmm. And I don't, if you go to other cities, there's some elements of this facade business, but nothing like the degree that it happens in Toronto. And David Winterton brought up this idea of Jack in the Box. He said a friend of his came from New York and went, what's going on with the buildings in Toronto? There's all these little facades, and then there's a huge building popping out of the middle of it. It's a Jack in the Box. And it sounds like a pejorative term at first, but I'd like to jump on it as a kind of friendly term that we might just think about, because I think the typology of the buildings in Toronto, how we're addressing massive growth, extremely massive growth. And we're going from a tiny town, Toronto was a very small town, to this city that's growing hugely. They've adapted, there's been several different kinds of adaptations of how to address that. And so there's a bit of a problem about how do you adjust to these new characteristics. And I'd like to point out one thing that concerns me about this facade retention piece is that it's done under the name of heritage. And it's actually more urban design, I think, frankly. And when it's done under heritage, these buildings are all preserved and conserved. And for example, on Yonge Street, we've had to clean and buff up and repair blocks of buildings on Yonge Street that they never looked like that. They never looked like that. They were often painted with big signs, had huge awnings and all kinds of stuff. And I worry that we're getting a structure built into our city which is rigid and not permissible to adjust and evolve and change as time goes on. So I think there is a kind of rigidity to this, which I think we need to kind of think about very carefully.
Yeah, and I think, that idea of authenticity, it's such a big, a big question, and we could go on about that for days in different contexts. But again, thinking about the Toronto context and what does that mean, I think that, in Toronto especially, people tend to, and people with, again, painting with a broad brush, tend to associate authenticity with what's old, right? Whether it brings up a sense of place, a sense of belonging, memory, nostalgia, again, another loaded term, because it might be longing for a time that maybe never existed. But again, I think that that term authentic is challenging, and that thing that's historic for a lot of Torontonians is, again, and Stefan, you've pointed this out a few times, the 19th century, right? When is authenticity is another big question we could ask, because it doesn't seem to extend to historic buildings from the modernist period, or now we're getting into, brutalist buildings are old and need heritage conservation and recognition, but they're not getting it because people don't conceive of it as historic in the same kind of way. So I think that's part of where that controversy surrounding facadism steps in, right? Those historic facades fall squarely within the remit of what's deemed authentic here in Toronto, again, harkening back to the colonial sort of town. And I think it causes a bit of a temporal schism in a way that people really get scared by, right? It sends a reminder of the present, but also of what we've lost. Yeah.
Could I mention also the idea about when you use the term facadism, architects think of facades in a very straightforward way. It's the front of the building, it's the public face of the building. But the general public has there's another connotation of facade, which is fake, right?
Yep.
You're wearing a facade. You're being deliberately deceitful. There's a kind of, and these two terms kind of glue together in an unattractive way. But I think there is that kind of just the common knowledge of how people use terms. It's there.
That's a great point.
And I would say, in the English language, even though I'm a writer, my official grasp of grammar is poor, so apologies. But an ism, and the suffix ism to a word, connotes a belief. So facadism, in a way, in its linguistic construction, connotes a belief in facades. So it's almost like inherently a pejorative term when we sort of contextualize it within how people understand that term facade. But I do want to touch on the idea of authenticity, which I think is so important. And we've sort of talked about that on the Yonge Street examples. I recently toured and wrote about 2 Queen West at Yonge and Queen, which is like a really, I think, beautifully executed ERA project. And it's one that I admire really very much, but it's not without its complexities. Because on the one hand, you've taken this, sort of northwest corner of Yonge and Queen, and you've restored the building to its original state at the expense of erasing all of the sort of like mess of what that building was throughout the 20th century, right? It was like a Woolworths with a big white facade. Then Lloyd Alter came around in the 1980s, and he made it into this sort of what I think Annabelle Vaughn described as a RoboCop building, which I thought was such a beautiful term. And all of these things, sort of they're reflections of places and time. And when we return to the idea of authenticity, it's sort of favoring one historical moment as being the real moment and the correct moment. But from 1895, within 6 months, a year of that building opening, it started to get scuffed up. People graffitied it up. It got redecorated and redecorated and redecorated. And like that palimpsest, is that not a form of authenticity? So I think to look at it in very sort of crude urbanistic terms, I think there's a value-based reason for why we would want to sort of preserve so much 19th century and Victorian architecture. To me, as a pedestrian, what I like about it is that it happened before the car. So it has a level of detail and a level of intricacy that you sort of best appreciate as a pedestrian, whereas sort of the facades and frontages that we put up as sort of like billboards throughout the 20th century, they're so big and crude that they're really designed around cars. But it comes back to the idea of values. I think authenticity and originalism is an easy way to escape having a sort of values-based conversation about heritage.
Yeah, totally. Let's do that. Because I think the sister of authenticity is taste. And taste is social. We know this. It's fundamental to understanding aesthetics and designs and architecture. And one thing we know for sure about it is that it changes. And then there are design principles. And they change too, but perhaps less mercurially. And I wonder, how do you see taste influencing our apprehension of facadism? And how do you see design principles doing the same? And how do they interact? Because they strike me as two very different things.
Mm-hmm.
I can start with that one, because I think it's interesting. You mentioned the detail on 19th century buildings. I think that's a challenge to contemporary architects. And I've been in circumstances where I've sort of, one of the arguments I made for retaining a facade was it's better than what the new architect might do. So just seriously, in terms of how it lands on the ground and what it does for pedestrians, that it might be better. And so that's a challenge for contemporary architects to figure out how do they address that particular issue. And I think it is an issue of, it's an architectural issues, and contemporary architects need to reevaluate and consider, because everything's not for a car. Everything's not, you drive past quick and it works fine if you're in a car, but if you're a pedestrian walking on the street, it's not the same deal. So I think there's a level to sort of say, there's something that's been lost in these facades, but there also is that evolutionary article, which point of view, which you pointed to. It's in fine art history. It's like if an anarchist comes and stabs a painting, do you leave the stab as part of the evolution of the painting so people understand it in its full cultural value or not, right? And so I think we need to address that, and I think we're far too simplistic in kind of restore to its original appearance, which I've said before isn't necessarily an original appearance, right?
No, that's it. And buildings take on the patina of age, like you said, Stefan, and they change over time. So, where do you restore to? I know that's a huge question. But, in terms of taste, yeah, it definitely factors into our understandings of facadism. And we know that architectural taste, and I say this to my students all the time, but it's a pendulum, right? It swings back and forth from the extremely rational to the more whimsical and fanciful. And I think part of this is that we're still kind of recovering and reacting to postmodernism in a way. And people really still don't like postmodernism. It was silly in a way. There's the perceived cheapness of it. Mostly of course, that comes from Michael Graves' Portland building, because he famously wrote about how he was cutting corners on costs and things like that. But I think, facadism inherently ties into that. It ties into those postmodern principles where we're integrating old and new and all of those things. So I think there's that kind of stigma in terms of taste that's tied into it. And yes, of course, there's some extreme offenders, but there's some where it's done really well and tastefully, and those ideas are incorporated. So I think, over time, it's going to be interesting, again, that looking back, seeing what we're going to make of this thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think taste is a really important subject, and one that I've struggled with a great deal as a writer. At the start of my career as an architecture critic, I was working for a place called Urban Toronto and was covering sort of like urban development, high rises in the city. And what I would do, and this is really embarrassing, but I would sort of whenever a new building was proposed, I had no idea. I had no sort of sense of judgment system to understand why is this good or not. So I'd go on there was an Urban Toronto discussion forum. I'd go on Twitter and I'd see what Alex Bezikovic and other people were saying, and then I'd say oh, this seems to be a development proposal that people like. Okay, this is good, or this is one that people don't like, or it's not good. But I had no internal mechanism of my own through which to evaluate things. And then a few years later, I was sitting at a patio in Kensington Market, Ronnie's, if we have any Ronnie's fans in the house. And so it's a lovely Kensington patio, and the view, if you look east towards downtown, is totally dominated by Aura. And Aura is I think the tallest residential building in Canada. You'll sort of recognize it has a sort of curved roof and these bright lights on top of it. And I was sitting there with a friend of mine, and what I knew from architectural taste making is that Aura is ugly. Everybody hates Aura. Aura sucks. And so I said to my friend, what an ugly building, that thing sucks, isn't it gross? And my friend, not being an architect, says to me, why? What's so bad about it? And I'm like, well, shit, I actually don't know, other than just dispensing what I've learned is the sort of correct urbanist architectural opinion. I actually had no value system through which to translate that. So I apologize, it's so long. Later that night, I asked my brother, who's an architect and had a lot more experience, I said, why is Aura ugly? And what he said to me is, he said, well, imagine if Aura was a person. What kind of personality would it have? It's so loud and overbearing and demanding attention that it's just a really arrogant type of presence on the street. I don't like arrogance, and so I think it's ugly. So what he did, and I will always remember it, is he translated this aesthetic taste-based question, and which, I think a lot about Pierre Bourdieu, which Michael, you introduced me to a lot of that work, which relates to sort of class and elitism of like having the right type of taste, whether it's in fashion or restaurants or bars or architecture or whatever, right? Like you can wear certain clothes that signify you as being a sophisticated person. And in a sense, like having the point of taste is to achieve a sort of higher class status, whether that's socioeconomically or culturally or whatever. So we've got to be really careful about taste. But what my brother did with that aura example is we reevaluate our judgments to be based not around aesthetic taste as an abstract thing, but to connect them to a sort of cultural or political set of values. If we talk about values rather than ugly or not ugly, I think that's a much more sort of productive public conversation.
Can you quickly make the leap, though, to how those factors inform our taste for facadism?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing. So I think that, to me, it's talking about like Toronto's uniqueness and heritage. And like, I think this sort of question of like a small city, a very small city becoming a very big city as being almost like a sort of unique challenge and how we try to navigate that. I think that's like a sort of political and cultural context, right? And as soon as we start to understand facadism within that political and cultural context, rather than just, or even a regulatory context, to go back to the urban planning side, we start to look on it, I think, in a more complex and maybe sympathetic way, rather than just, here's a thing that developers and architects are doing, is it good or not? Right? So I think, for me as a critic, I can't just tell people, this is the correct taste, you should all have my taste because I'm more sophisticated than you. That's a really horrible thing to believe. So with facadism, if we situate that idea of taste to become about city building and growth, should we embrace the 19th century city, or should we be more assertive about being a 21st century city? Then I think it makes for a richer conversation about which projects are good and bad and why.
With the time in mind, because I think we want to get a few questions, I'll just have you all close by commenting on whether facadism is special. Because cities like Toronto over the last 200 years, they have been built and rebuilt and rebuilt many times. So cities change. And I wonder if you think facadism fits within just a general narrative of urban evolution, or whether it's a standout phenomenon.
I could start.
Yeah.
I think it's a standout phenomenon. I do think there's all kinds of historic precedents for facadism, but I think in Toronto it's unique. Something's happening that's really unusual in the city of Toronto, which is like, it's like you're a teenager and your pants don't fit. Like it's like there's a level, as you've sort of said, it's growing from a very tiny town to a huge city. And our growth is, we often sort of say our growth should be like, we should be like Paris, or we should be like London. We're more like Shanghai, or we're more like Asian cities. And there you do get intense scale differentials that just happen suddenly. And we're in that position as well. And so we have I think we're unique. I think people are going to come to Toronto in the future to see our jack-in-the-boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, Toronto is such a unique case study to talk about facadism. I mean, it exists elsewhere, but not on the scale that it does here. And I think it boils down to, and we've been sort of touching on this idea, but Toronto's a city that's always been in an identity crisis, right? It's always wanted to be something other than what it is, right? Trying to shed its colonial kind of outpost, remote, small city vibe. And we got into the 20th century and it wanted to desperately be seen on the world stage, whatever that means, right? So what we're seeing, facadism is kind of trying to grapple with that, grapple with our identity of not wanting to be what it actually is, but again, a city in in the middle of massive growth, but also on the precipice of even more growth. So it's, again, it's a really strange kind of phenomenon that I think we can really closely identify now with Toronto, for better or worse.
Yeah, and I think that history has a way of changing our perceptions, and it's like, I like that analogy of you're a teenager and your pants don't fit, and then maybe when you revisit a photo of yourself as a 16-year-old, sort of bursting out of your jeans, as a 20-year-old, you're like, oh my God, cringe, right? Like, I don't want to look at that. When you revisit it as a 25-year-old, you think, oh my God, cringe, I don't want to look at that. When you revisit it as a 40-year-old, you might treasure how accurately that awkward-ass photo represents a certain time period of your life and how much it tells your story. So I think, facadism tells the story of Toronto in the 21st century as a really unique city undertaking a really unique set of challenges. Sometimes, usually not very gracefully, but I think in the benefit of retrospect, I think we're going to look back on it as something really special. And Christ, like whatever form of urban development we come up with after might be like a lot worse. So who knows?
Very well said, everyone. Anyone have any questions in the room? I haven't seen anything from online. Come up to the mic stand if you'd like to ask something. I do have one from online now. Let's see. When a building is facadimized, that's another little made-up term for this process in Toronto. Is it delisted from the register, or are there previous criteria for determination officially updated? Does the city often require permanent interpretation installations or other similar mitigation to balance the loss of historic material?
I could help with that one, because I think when the city designates a property, they're designating the architectural elements, and in most cases, those are the facade. In an architectural terms, the architecture of the building is the facade. The rest is the building, which is different than architecture. And so most of the elements are on the facade. There are lots of buildings that actually have interesting interiors that were more public in a way. So you went into a banquet hall, or you went into a concert hall, or you went in, there's various places that have interior elements, and those, the city pretty much insists that those interior elements also be retained, so that's a different kind of category. But basically they're done in a way that they respond to the retention of the attributes of the heritage facade, and they're all retained or even restored. And there is often an interpretation plan that goes with that, which works in many different ways.
If there, please just come up if you think of something, but in the meantime, I wondered what you all thought about facade retention projects that don't incorporate a high-rise and ones that do, and how they might be viewed differently. For instance, whatever it's called now, the Scotiabank Arena, I think is like kind of universally beloved, or say even Maple Leaf Gardens, which we worked on, or take like the White House. There's a picture of that full facade retention that happened in the 50s. Like, people don't think of those facadism projects the same way they do a Jack in the Box project. And I wondered, like, do you think that points towards it's more of a resistance to the development than it is to the fact of demolishing a historic interior, or do you think those things, how do you think those things play out?
Yeah, a combination of things. I mean, again, that we don't necessarily recognize it immediately as facadism, I think speaks to, it was better quality than the ones that are just sort of slapdash. That I equate to the student who didn't really read the instructions and kind of waited till the last minute, and it kind of works, but it kind of doesn't. Again, my educator background is showing. But then when we have, like Scotiabank Arena, where we have the shell that's preserved, we don't necessarily think of that as facadism because it's not just the facade, right? But we can expand that definition in the present as well as historically. So it's interesting to think about facadism in all of its different iterations, but of course the one that we latch onto is the one that causes the most controversy, and it's the meatiest one to discuss, I think.
Well, I think it's a really good question because I think like the high rises give like an obvious element of like resistance just because they're so hard to ignore. But I also, coming back to history, there's St. Lawrence Market image, right? And that's a facadism project. We can call it that with retrospect. But I think history has a way of making the incoherent coherent. So things that seem incoherent to us now, which are these sort of like very contemporary facade type projects, will in their own way seem coherent to Torontonians 100 years from now.
Yeah, I think it's, people are really, I think in many cases when they're talking about facadism, they're talking about a shock in the sense of the small scale retail is gone. There's a large development of single property owner has amalgamated many, there's that kind of issue of just the scale differential that people are responding to. I think that's where people are using this term, and they're using it in a very negative way because they're using the negative pejorative kind of sense of creating something unreal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a kind of longing for the past in a certain way, whatever that looks like, that definitely comes into play when we think about, what we associate with the term facadism and the kind of response to the rapid pace of life right now. I think it all ties together.
Yeah, totally.
I don't know if I think it's a longing for the past so much as a sense of a continuation, some sort of connection to a I mean, there's something very alienating about being in a city and not having any sense of a history or a past to the city that you're in. So, I mean, I personally think, yes, there are a lot of awkward facade projects, but I also am glad that we're doing it for the exact reason that you're saying, that it is part of this record that we can read. There has been a city here since the 19th century. Those buildings are categorically different than what was built in the 20th century when it was more of an automobile culture, and now the city is coming into this new scale where we want interesting buildings to look at, and unfortunately, developers don't seem to be either interested in or compelled to build them until, we're starting to see changes in that area too, but for a long time they weren't. So, this is what we have, and I agree. I think in 100 years, this is going to be, like you said, the palimpsest of the city. It's the building is palimpsest, rather than just like the whole. And it is, as Michael said, something that's unique to this city. So I think it's interesting. Thank you for everybody, by the way.
Thank you so much.
Super interesting.
I think that might be it.
I have one more.
Oh, yep, please.
Hi. Well, something I've noticed about facadism is that I don't think this concept is really it's probably been used throughout time because you have a lot of buildings even in, let's say, a really old city like Rome, you have buildings that you have Roman structures built into a more modern structures, even the Rome Stock Exchange is you see these pillars on the outside, which are from the Temple of Hadrian, stuck onto the building, and it's kind of incorporated to create more of a part of the function. And I just, in those cases, you had 1,000 years, the building kind of went down and everything, and it does preserve a part of its history by incorporating it in there instead of just taking it down and even trying to, even though maybe it doesn't, these buildings always doesn't fit the original structure, but they create a new structure kind of contributing to the story, and you realize, okay, yeah, this city has a long history, so in some ways that sort of facadism can be good. In some ways, I just feel in Toronto, I feel we don't know where we're going with this, because I feel sometimes it's because we can't figure out what to do with the older buildings. So instead of figuring out something or adapting it in a way, we kind of just go, let's just put that comment said about putting a hat on top of a building. in some ways, some of them are okay, but it kind of like when you have certain buildings, and there's one that stands out to me, the United Church building. It's like this really old church, and I don't have any like nostalgia about it because I didn't grow up in Toronto. So, and but you know, no, but I did see the original church. But when I saw them tearing it down just to keep the facade, and then they're going to put in like residential stuff in there, I kind of felt like, what are we doing here, you know, and everything, because it was a church which was meant for a community, and it was kind of a communal space, an exchange in the city. And yeah, you keep the facade, but as a person who has studied a lot of church, a lot of the interior of the churches are important too, even probably more than the facade, especially if it's like Protestant, unless it's Catholic. You know, Catholic has a bit more outer decoration, but the inside. And then adding to that too is just, it's creating more condos. So I'm like, you have a communal space that was meant for the community, and now you're just using it to create condos for people who can't now afford it. And I'm not criticizing that, because it's like, I know you have to figure out sometimes what to do, but it's kind of, when I think you brought up about values, kind of, that really just stands out. It's like more stands out than me than some other buildings do that maybe was a house or office building, and that question of where are our values?
Yeah. And I think it's a really important point, and I think what's going to happen decades from now, when we see that a church and its sort of public space and the uniqueness of that interior could be torn down to build a high-rise, and that if you go half a block down, you're going to find some rich people's houses that could not be torn down to build a high-rise. We're going to realize that the urban planning and regulatory system that we've had in this city since the 20th century has the wrong set of values.
Yeah, great points, Rebecca. I think we can tie facadism to the history of spolia, like you were talking about, right? It's a sort of different version of that. But you raise some really great points. And I think we also need to think about, you know, we can't keep everything. We all know this. But on the scale, the hierarchy of heritage, I think we'll be glad in the future that we have what we have, even if we're just clinging to scraps in a way, right? So again, that's a bigger conversation, I think. But again, some great points raised there. Thanks.
That's good. I think great comments, because I love the connection to spolia, which is exactly what we're doing. We're using, reinterpreting, and creating new meanings and different meanings for what we have in the city. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a beautiful afternoon. It was such a pleasure chatting with you guys.
A lot of fun. Thanks so much.